I saw a gladiator fight with my own eyes. And what I learned about ancient Rome will change how you see history forever. When I say the word gladiator, most people picture a shackled prisoner thrown into the Colosseum to be torn apart. But that's not the full picture. What if I told you some men actually signed up to become gladiators? Willingly? It's true, arenas weren't filled only with condemned criminals or enslaved fighters. There was an entire group of men who chose this path. They were called octorati, and they signed legal contracts to fight in the games. Not because they had to, but because the arena offered something nothing else in Rome could, a chance to be remembered. And these weren't just clueless amateurs. Many were ex-soldiers, desperate debtors, or men who had fallen on hard times and saw the arena as their way back into society, or into history itself. Step into the arena, survive long enough, and your name could echo across the empire. That promise pulled in more people than you'd think. Some gladiators even had fans, people who followed their careers, carved their names into walls, and cheered for them in the stands. These men weren't always faceless bodies in armor. They had reputations, personalities, and in rare cases, real influence. But make no mistake, it wasn't an easy life. Choosing this path meant giving up most of your freedom and safety. Still, for some, that was better than being forgotten. They didn't get dragged into the sand screaming. They walked in willingly, eyes open, chasing something bigger. What drove a man to make that choice? That's the question historians still wrestle with. But one thing is certain, the arena wasn't just a stage for the enslaved. It also pulled in men who thought they could carve their name into legend with nothing but grit, muscle, and steel. And honestly, that's only scratching the surface. What really happened behind the Colosseum walls is way stranger than the clichés we usually hear. At first glance, the Roman Colosseum looks like nothing more than a crumbling ruin. But when I picture what it used to be, it feels closer to a Hollywood special effects arena than an ancient battleground. Beneath all that stone was a world of moving parts, trapdoors, pulleys, even a kind of retractable roof, all designed to turn fights into full-blown spectacles. Let me take you underground. Beneath the wooden arena floor was a massive labyrinth called the Hypogeum. 2 levels of tunnels, cages, and elevators powered the whole show. I imagine lions exploding out of the ground mid-fight, or a massive stage prop rising from the sand like magic. These trapdoors weren't just mechanical tricks, they were built to shock the crowd and keep them constantly guessing. Historians say there were over 30 lifts, each run by teams of workers cranking winches and pulling ropes hidden from sight. That meant a gladiator could suddenly be swarmed by wild boars, or find new opponents rising straight from beneath his feet. The whole arena was less like a stage and more like a living machine. And then there was the velarium, the giant retractable canopy stretched across the seating area. Imagine ancient Rome's version of a stadium roof. Sailors, not gladiators, handled it because it took real nautical skill to spread those massive sheets of fabric. The goal was simple: keep the crowd shaded and cool so the emperor could run games all day long. To me, this wasn't just architecture, it was pure psychology. The Colosseum wasn't only about violence, it was designed to manipulate the crowd, heighten emotions, and create suspense. People didn't just come to watch, they came to be completely overwhelmed. If you thought the world of Roman gladiators was strictly a man's game, think again. Hidden in the shadows of history is a secret I love bringing up: women fought in the arena too. They were called gladiatrices, and when they stepped into the sand, the crowds couldn't take their eyes off them. Female gladiators were rare, but they weren't some cheap sideshow. They trained, wore armor, and were expected to perform just like the men. Roman writers even described women battling animals, or each other, during special nighttime events meant to stir up excitement. These weren't back alley fights. They happened in official arenas in front of thousands. One of my favorite pieces of proof comes from Halicarnassus, an ancient relief showing 2 female fighters, Amazon and Achillea, locked in combat. The inscription says they were released with honor, meaning no death, but still with the crowd's full approval. These women weren't faceless, they had stage names, personas, and real presence in the Roman imagination. Of course, the elite were divided. Some called female gladiators scandalous, a sign of moral decline. Others loved the spectacle, bragging about hosting women in their games. Even emperors got in on it. Domitian once staged torchlit female fights in his private arena. Imagine the audience completely spellbound. What fascinates me most is that these women weren't just fighters, they were entertainers. They had to master combat, but also the drama. They knew how to raise tension, sell the clash, and make the crowd roar. In a way, they were athlete, actor, and political symbol, all rolled into one. We've all seen it in movies, an emperor looming over the arena, raising his thumb to spare a fighter, or turning it down to kill him. But here's the twist, that famous gesture? It's more Hollywood invention than real Roman history. The truth is, nobody actually knows what the signals were. Ancient writers only mention vague terms like pollis verso, with turned thumb. But they never spelled out which direction meant what. Some scholars even think a thumbs up might have meant death, like mimicking a sword thrust while a tucked thumb into the fist signaled mercy, as if sheathing the blade. And it wasn't some casual flick of the hand either. If a gladiator lost but gave the crowd a thrilling show, the audience could demand his life be spared. The final say went to the sponsor of the games, maybe a wealthy noble, maybe the emperor himself, but they listened to the crowd. Shouts of "Mide" meant spare him. Jugula meant kill him. It all came down to performance. A fighter who showed courage, skill, or even earned sympathy often walked away to fight another day. But if the show was dull or cowardly, that could be the end. Even in an age built on blood and spectacle, Romans wanted heart, style, and honor. In reality, death wasn't even the standard outcome. Gladiators were costly to train and keep alive. Killing them off in every fight just didn't make sense economically. That dramatic final pause, the crowd holding its breath, waiting for the decision, was part of the show. The suspense itself was often worth more than the actual result. So where did the whole thumbs down means death idea even come from? Most likely from later artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme in the 19th century. His famous painting cemented that image in people's minds, and then Hollywood amplified it until it became fact. So now, whenever I see that classic thumbs down gesture on screen, I remind myself, the truth is way more nuanced. The Colosseum wasn't just a slaughterhouse, it was a carefully choreographed performance where even the tiniest gesture could decide whether someone lived or died. It sounds like something straight out of a horror novel, but in ancient Rome, gladiator sweat and blood were actually bottled and sold. And yes, people paid for it. These weren't just gruesome souvenirs, they were thought to hold real power. Roman doctors sometimes prescribed gladiator blood for epilepsy, while more superstitious Romans believed it could boost strength, courage, or even passion. After a match, attendants would scrape the sweat and oil from a gladiator's skin using a tool called a strigil. That mix, known as gladiator unguentum, was collected and sold in little vials, often right outside the arena. Some people wore it like perfume, others used it in rituals. The logic went like this: a gladiator had just risked his life in combat, so his sweat was seen as charged with raw energy and masculinity. Blood had its own market too. When a gladiator was killed, some spectators literally rushed to soak up drops of his blood with cloth, or even drink it straight from the sand. And as disturbing as that sounds, it wasn't just senseless brutality, it was belief. They thought courage and vitality could be absorbed. No fitness brands, no supplements, no Instagram, but this was their version of power in a bottle. Even cosmetic sellers joined the craze. Some beauty products claimed to contain tiny amounts of gladiator oil, as if violence itself could make your skin glow. Strange as it sounds, the gladiator's body became a commodity. Their fame reached far beyond the arena into medicine, cosmetics, and myth. Forget protein shakes and steak. I've learned gladiators were called barley men for a reason. Their diet wasn't meat-heavy or luxurious at all. It was based on barley, legumes, and vegetables, with one strange extra ingredient: wood ash. When I dug into excavations at gladiator cemeteries, especially in Ephesus, I found that their bones showed incredibly high calcium levels, even higher than Roman elites. Historians believe that came from a vinegar-based tonic mixed with ash. Yes, actual ash from burned plants or wood. And it wasn't random. The minerals from the ash helped keep their bones strong and able to recover from the brutal blunt force trauma of the arena. Their meals were designed for endurance, not raw explosiveness. Barley and beans provided long-lasting energy and also kept fighters heavier, which might sound odd until you realize that carrying a little extra fat actually protected their organs from cuts. Plus, it made injuries look more dramatic without being instantly fatal. In the arena, a little blood made the show exciting, but a fighter dying too fast ruined the entertainment. What really struck me was how practical it all was. That high-carb, low-meat diet made training sustainable. Meat was expensive, and gladiators weren't treated like kings. They were investments. Their food wasn't about luxury, it was about keeping them in the fight as long as possible. In a weird way, their nutrition plan looked more like the meal prep of modern endurance athletes than a warrior's feast. So the next time Hollywood shows gladiators tearing into raw meat with their bare hands, I can't help but laugh. The real fuel of the arena was a humble bowl of barley porridge, with a splash of vinegar and, yes, even a spoonful of ash on top. Despite what movies like to show us, I've found that gladiator fights weren't all about kill or be killed. In reality, most matches didn't end in death. And it wasn't because Rome suddenly grew a conscience, it was because dead gladiators were terrible for business. When I looked into it, I realized training a gladiator took serious time, money, and resources. These weren't just random mobs thrown into a pit. They lived in barracks, had instructors, strict diets, and even medical care. Losing a trained fighter in every match would have been a financial disaster. So matches were designed to be thrilling, but still survivable. Now, don't get me wrong, fights weren't gentle. The weapons were real, wounds were common, and plenty of fighters were scarred for life. But the whole idea was to test endurance, skill, and heart. Not to kill every time. It's more like an ancient version of MMA with swords, where you could lose and still walk away to fight again next month. What I find really interesting is that victories brought glory, sure, but even a defeated gladiator could earn respect if he fought bravely. The crowd wasn't just after blood, they wanted drama and tension. And if the audience roared loud enough, they could sway the final verdict. Life or death wasn't some random flip of a coin. It was basically a performance review. From what records suggest, gladiators might have actually died in only 1 out of 10 matches. Even that number varied depending on the era and location. Over time, more rules came in and blood sports became more controlled. So that myth of constant carnage, that's not Roman history, it's mostly modern imagination. Behind all the cheers of the Colosseum, I've learned there was a much harsher reality: the training schools where gladiators lived and drilled every single day. These weren't casual gyms, they were fortified compounds where men were trained like weapons and treated like assets. The biggest of them all, the Ludus Magnus, sat right next to the Colosseum. From the outside, it looked like a simple barracks, but inside it was a pressure cooker. Recruits trained under the watch of Lanestae, strict disciplinarians who enforced order and shaped fighters from the ground up. Most newcomers arrived weak, scarred, or broken. Only a few ever became true arena-ready gladiators. Training was relentless. Wooden weapons, endless shield drills, footwork routines, it was repetition on repeat. These men weren't just swinging wildly. Every strike had to be calculated, every reaction precise. They were being taught not just how to fight, but how to survive, entertain, and control their fear under the roar of thousands. The living conditions were cramped. Gladiators shared tiny rooms, had almost no contact with the outside world, and were constantly monitored. Some schools even supervised bathroom breaks. The entire system was designed around discipline, conditioning, and preparing the body to withstand pain. And yet, what fascinates me most is that inside those walls, a strange sense of identity grew. Some fighters felt loyalty to their school, even pride in their progress. Rivalries flared, friendships formed. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't chaos either. It was a system built to break men down, then rebuild them into legends. If you thought lions and gladiators were the craziest things to hit the Colosseum floor, wait until you hear this: Romans once flooded the arena to stage naval battles. I'm talking real ships, real water, real chaos. These spectacles were called nomachii, and they weren't just for fun. They were designed to flaunt the emperor's wealth and power. At first, they didn't even happen inside the Colosseum. Whole lakes were dug just so crowds could watch boat battles. But eventually, Roman engineering evolved, and the Colosseum itself became the stage for war at sea. From what historians believe, in the arena's earliest years, engineers actually managed to flood the floor through underground channels. The sand was cleared, the basin filled, and suddenly warships floated into position. Then came the reenactments, historic naval scenes played out with costumes, props, and even pyrotechnics. Prisoners and trained fighters became living chess pieces in front of thousands of spectators. Of course, it couldn't last forever. Once the underground hypogym system was added for trapdoors and lifts, flooding the arena became nearly impossible. But for a short window of time, the Romans literally turned the Colosseum into a man-made sea, all in the name of spectacle. To me, this is one of the boldest examples of Roman ambition. They weren't just entertaining crowds, They were showing the world that not even nature could limit them. If they needed an ocean, they built one. We usually picture gladiators as nameless fighters lost to history, but the truth is, many of them had what every modern influencer dreams of: fans, followers, and even their own kind of branding. Their names were shouted in the streets, carved into walls, and yes, printed on merchandise. Take Flama, for example, one of the most famous gladiators born in Syria. He was offered freedom 4 separate times and turned it down every single time. Why? Because for him, being a gladiator wasn't just about survival, it was about status. In Pompeii, people literally scratched hearts into the walls next to the names of fighters like Crescens and Varus, treating them like sports stars of their day. Their faces and stage names showed up on oil lamps, mugs, figurines, and mosaics. And this wasn't elite-only memorabilia. Everyday Romans could own a little piece of their favorite fighter. It was basically Rome's version of collectible merch. With names like Hermes or Spiculus, they weren't just men, they were brands marketed and bet on in taverns across the empire. Some gladiators even had sponsors or wealthy patrons who gave them gifts, paid their medical bills, or supported them after big fights. Women left love notes, some even offered marriage. And in rare cases, retired gladiators didn't just fade into obscurity. They stepped into politics or business, carrying their fame into new arenas. So no, these guys weren't just faceless brawlers in helmets. They were public figures, part athlete, part performer. The Colosseum wasn't just a battlefield, it was a stage. And for their fans, the show didn't end when the fight was over. A fight in the arena might have looked like pure chaos from the stands, but I know now it was calculated theater. The weapons gladiators used weren't random. They were chosen specifically to create balance, tension, and spectacle. Every match was about contrast, not just brute force. There were different gladiator types, each with a unique fighting style. Take the Myrmillo. He was heavily armored, carried a huge shield and a short sword. Strong but slow. And who did he often face? A retiarius, practically bare-chested, armed only with a net, trident, and dagger. It was always set up as speed versus power, agility versus defense. Then there was the Secutor, whose smooth helmet was designed specifically to resist the net of a retiarius. That wasn't just coincidence. That was tactical design, giving every matchup its own dynamic. Some duels were slow and technical, others explosive and unpredictable. Even the armor itself added drama. Lopsided pairings told a story the crowd could follow. One fighter was like a tank, weighed down by steel. The other darted around like a shadow, and because the armor limited vision and movement differently, the result was never certain. These matchups weren't just entertaining, they were engineered to trigger gasps, cheers, and suspense. Gladiators didn't always know who they'd be facing, but the organizers did. They understood crowd psychology centuries before modern entertainment ever gave it a name. In a way, the arena worked like a chessboard, only this one was played with blood and every piece had its own rules. Gladiator battles weren't just about men fighting men. Sometimes the real opponent had forelegs, claws, and teeth. The animal fights, called venationes, were some of the most hyped events in the arena. And yes, lions were absolutely part of the show. Exotic beasts were shipped in from all over the empire: lions from North Africa, tigers from India, bears from the Alps. They were kept in underground cages and then released through trapdoors to shock both the fighters and the crowd. The point wasn't just to kill the animal, it was to stage something wild, unpredictable, and terrifying. But honestly, the real chaos didn't always come from the arena floor. Behind the scenes, conditions were insanely risky. Stressed animals could, and did, break loose. There are reports of leopards escaping backstage and mauling guards before they even made it into the arena. At one show, elephants panicked so badly they nearly stampeded the crowd. The danger didn't stop at the sand. That's where the bestiarii came in, specialist animal fighters who had to take these creatures on with minimal protection. Some carried spears or whips, others nothing more than a net and nerves of steel. Survival wasn't just about muscle, it was about reading animal behavior, making split-second calls, and sometimes just plain luck. And make no mistake, these weren't filler acts. They were headliners, often used to open or close a day of games. Sometimes the arena floor was transformed into an entire forest just to make it feel like a wild hunt playing out in real time. But behind all the spectacle was a brutal reality. The lions were real. The risks were real. And sometimes the scariest part wasn't the beast in the arena. It was what happened when everything else went completely wrong. Gladiator fights didn't just vanish, they evolved. Today, across Europe and North America, I've seen reenactment groups bring gladiatorial combat back to life using authentic techniques, gear, and rules pulled straight from ancient sources. And trust me, these aren't just backyard cosplay meetups. A lot of them are backed by historians and archaeologists, and the fighters spend months mastering how to move and strike exactly like their Roman counterparts. When I was in Rome, I even came across a school where you can actually train as a gladiator, either for tourists or live demonstrations. You get armor, a wooden sword, and a crash course in ancient tactics. It's not about blood anymore, it's about education, spectacle, and immersion. Some of these events are tied to museum programs, others happen in reconstructed arenas or huge historical festivals. And here's the crazy part. Even without the real danger, the tension, the strategy, and the drama feel shockingly real. The crowds cheer, the fighters clash, and for a few minutes, it's like the ancient world is alive again. Only this time, without the risk of a fatal ending. Step into a packed stadium with me. Hear the roar of the crowd, the lights blasting down, and two fighters squaring off. It's not ancient Rome, but I swear the echoes are there. When I watch modern combat sports, whether it's boxing, MMA, pro wrestling, or even certain martial arts tournaments, I can't help but see the DNA of the gladiator games still pulsing through them. Just like in the Colosseum, fighters today build personas, wear iconic gear, and step into the ring to either wild cheers or brutal boos. They train for years, hype up rivalries, and promote matchups that make fans restless before the fight even begins. Back then, it was Spiculus versus Varus. Now it's McGregor or Fury, selling the story long before the first punch lands. And when you look closer, the media coverage, the fan clubs, even the sponsorship deals, it all feels like a modern remix of what gladiators experienced, only bigger and glossier. Just like in Rome, it's not always the strongest fighter who wins the spotlight. It's the one who tells the best story, pulls off the flashiest moves, or leaves the most unforgettable impression. Even the arenas themselves look like digital Colosseums now. Massive stadiums, blinding lights, giant screens, cameras everywhere. The production is just as much a part of the show as the fight itself. We may not swing swords anymore, but the hunger for spectacle, skill, and raw competition is exactly the same. The rules changed, the weapons changed, but the crowd? Still hungry for a fight. That's about it. Would you like to travel back in time and personally watch gladiatorial fights? Write in the comments. And don't forget to check out my other videos.